So if you have 10 to 15 minutes that you'll never get back in your life, I'm going to talk about the great 1984 Los Angeles Olympic SWAT Lobster Caper. And the way this came about is, number one, never volunteer for anything that you don't fully understand you're volunteering into. So during the 1984 Olympics, we had LAPD SWAT, we had SEAL Team 6, we had Delta, we had members, we had Task Force 160, Night Stalkers, which are the aviation arm of Special Forces. We had the FBI's Hostage Rescue Team. We had LASO SEB, our counterparts for the Sheriff's Department. So had a lot of assets on the deck, and pretty eye-watering what we were capable of at the time. And everybody expected big things to happen, that we're going to have more terrorist incidents along the line of Munich and so forth. So, that being said, one day we're up there training, and I was a sniper at the time, and I'm talking to a guy named Ryan Vanderhook, and at the time in 1984, lobsters were not, as they say in New England, lobsters, but lobsters were not real common in Los Angeles area. You could get them, but they were small. And we were talking about how much we like lobsters, and at the time, my dad, who was a retired naval captain and worked for General Dynamics and then Electric Boat on the Trident programs, those were the Trident submarines, Ohio and Los Angeles Fast Attack. And they lived in my parents lived in Old Lyme, Connecticut. And there's a place in Mystic called Abbott's Lobster House. So we decided for the snipers, and at the time there were approximately about 20 of us, and we had Sniper Observer, and we decided, hey, it'd be kind of nice to get some lobsters in. We'll have like a little lobster clam bake. So I called my father up and said, look, how much would it cost? Can you find out from Abbott's Lobster House how much it would cost for 23-pound lobsters? So he did. Next day he calls me back up and gives me the price. I told Brian Vanderhook, and he goes off and talks to the lieutenant. And at some point it morphs from the 20 of us to 60 of us. We're actually 66, 67, because you have 6 supervisors, 60 operators, and 1 lieutenant. I called my dad back the next day, and how much would it cost for 67 3-pound lobsters? And they have to cull these. In other words, they get the lobsters. It's not something you can do overnight, because they have to cull them, they have to find the 3-pounders, they have to isolate them, and so forth. I'm not all big on lobster mania, but I like lobster, but how they call them is beyond me. Anyway, it didn't take very long for this to morph from 67 into 243-pound Maine lobsters. Now, this is a problem in that, one, it's going to take some time, and this is about a month and a half out from the Olympics. But Abbott's Lobster House said, yeah, we can do this. And they have to ship them overnight, because they have to be they have to be alive. So they have to be packed in wet seaweed and cold storage. And we also ordered 80 pounds of what they call Long Island pisses, which are soft shell long neck clams, 80 pounds or 85 pounds of those. And so we get all the money in, and I send it. And it was substantial at the time, but 243-pound live Maine lobsters. Now, the people who were in charge of this at this point in time, I'm going to show you my old fire team from the 1984 Olympics, would be the following. We had Frank Micah, who is no longer with us, unfortunately, a great guy. Myself, John Helms, team leader, Bob Guzman, central player here, and then Larry Mudgett. And this is taken up at the Academy Grounds, 1984, just prior to the kickoff of the 1984 Olympics here in Los Angeles. So the people that are going to be involved are Frank Micah, myself, and Bob Guzman. Now, that being said, we get all set up, and our lieutenant at the time, Jeff Rogers, who was a hell of a leader, but very, 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 he had an unusual personality, I'll put it that way, but extremely effective. And he said, okay, Reitz, you guys are all in charge of cooking lobsters since you grew up on the East Coast. I lived in Maryland. I lived in Massachusetts 2 different times, Chelsea, and then in Mashfield, and also in Rhode Island, right on the Sakonnet River on island of Aquidneck. So I was somewhat well versed in New England seafood, and I was basically put in charge. And the day starts to arrive, and I realized about 3 weeks out that how am I going to cook 240 3-pound live Maine lobsters? I mean, the average pot's about this big. There's no way I'd be there for months. So I started calling around. Every restaurant I called in Los Angeles said, "You're out of your mind. There's no way you can cook that many." Somebody came up with a brilliant idea of getting a hold of the Marine Corps. And the Marine Corps have field stoves. And a field stove, it runs on either kerosene, I believe, or gasoline. And called down to Pendleton, and there was a staff sergeant there who was in charge of logistics. And he said, "I can bring up 3 field stoves, United States Marine Corps field stoves. These things are huge. I don't know how much, they probably about 30 gallons, maybe more, I don't know. They're big." Okay, so the big day is about to arrive, and this is the middle of the summer, 1984, so it's probably about 100 and, I don't know, 10 out in the valley. It was not much of a party. And in the intervening weeks leading up to this, I had gone back and forth with dozens upon dozens of phone calls, gathering all the money. There were, considerations about that. Getting a venue site, we ended up getting the National Guard site out in the Sepulveda Basin right off of Woodley in the San Fernando Valley. So we were able to use their entire kind of a parking lot area, and in conjunction with the building itself for the National Guard. And bottom line is, the Marine Corps Sergeant, myself, Frank Micah, Bob Guzman, we end up at the on the big day, on the event. They're going to have softball with all the different units at a different location out in the valley. And the 3 of us are in charge of cooking 240 3-pound live Maine lobsters, in addition to 85 pounds of steamed clams, and the corn, and we had the beer and everything else. And there were copious amounts of beer. Anyway, and I mean literally probably about 25 gallons of butter. So we get there about 0400 hours in the morning, and up comes the Marine Corps. They come up, they drop off the stoves. The sergeant gives us very specific instructions. He shows us on all 3 stoves, which again, believe they ran off of gasoline, said if this needle gets into the red, these things will blow up. And it's no joke, people will die. Okay, not a big thing, not too worried about it. The one problem though is we've been training, running what we call gunning and running back in those days, very hard. And so the 3 of us decide this is going to be a long day. We're going to be out there forever, and we're waiting for the lobsters to come out. And of course, there's ice cold beer, a lot of it. And like any good, dutiful SWAT officers, don't have to work. We're not on call, not on standby. We start drinking beer. Not necessarily a great mix, but it was fun. And so around 1,300 hours. And we're still waiting for lobsters. And remember, these things have to be flown in, and they have to be driven out. And I believe that the whole thing was supposed to kick off around 1,500 hours. The whole thing was going to start. And everybody was going to show up for this massive lobster fest. So about 1,400 hours, we have no lobsters. And they haven't arrived. And I'm trying to make phone calls. This is way before. This is when we had pagers. We didn't have cell phones. So you had to run, use a payphone, call Abbott's Lobster House, had to call the airlines had to call UPS, I believe it was at the time, when it was just starting out. And it was this huge just chain of communications that had to be gotten through in order to find out the status of lobsters. Well, it was around 1,400 hours, and up comes this UPS truck. The driver jumps out. He's got the biggest set of eyes I've ever seen in the world. He's just scared to death. And he said, "What do you guys have in there?" And we open up the back, and you can hear all this like this. Well, that is the combined sound of 243-pound live Maine lobsters, which are making lobster sounds. And this guy was scared out of his mind. And it didn't have lobsters on the boxes. They were these big brown boxes. They had holes in them, but they had wet seaweed, ice packs, and everything else. So we found that kind of humorous. We gave him a beer. I think he took off. Yeah, we started cooking. And actually we did pretty well. We ended up, literally dropping about 30 lobsters into a pot at a time. It was insane. And the steamed clams. So the problem is when you're cooking all day long and you're trying to coordinate all the stuff going on, at the end of the day, there are lobster pieces everywhere. They're a massive mess, even though some people tried to help clean up. We're the ones responsible, the three of us. And I never got a lobster, not a single one. I did find one clam that somebody stepped on, so I had that. And when everybody blew chalks and took off and wheels up, this is now probably about 2,100 hours at night. And there was a lot of drinking and everything else, and everybody's getting ready. There's a few more days till the Olympics kicked off. And the three of us are standing there looking at each other, and the commanding officer comes up and said, "I'm going to tell you something. We have a general inspection tomorrow. This place has to be immaculate." And the three of us looked at each other and went, "Oh my God." Well, to make a long story short, we didn't get out of there until about 5 the next morning. We had to mop, wax the floors. Everybody had walked in. We initially had paper down to go from outside across the gymnasium floor, which was wood, into the heads for the women and men. Of course, that got chewed up pretty quickly, so there were lobster pieces, there were clams, there were melted butter. It was a frigging nightmare. And I learned after that to never volunteer. But that is my story on the great SWAT Lobster Caper. I think a lot of people out there, if you ever remember this, love to hear about it, love you guys to comment on it. But I will never do that again, I can tell you that. So a lot of fun, great memories, but never to be repeated. Thank you.